Let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. And Dave, you run a company, and your company is in an LLC, correct?
That's correct.
We've got the podcast in an LLC, but I don't think my parents run an LLC on their farm. I know my in-laws have a corporation, but we're going to explore today what might be the right route for you in your farm or your business as far as an entity structure goes.
Man, there's a lot of them that I can think of as people buy farmland from me, from corporations, S-corps, partnerships, LLPs. Man, there's a bunch of them acronyms, Tanner.
I was going to say, I don't even know what half of those mean. So it's a good thing that we have Ryan here with us today. Ryan's a local attorney. He's a good friend of ours, local community member, but that doesn't discount his expertise. Just because people are friends of ours doesn't make them dumb. Can I say that on the podcast?
I think you can.
All right, we'll run with that. But he's an attorney who assists clients with real estate projects, business formation, transitions, and estate planning. Works with clients of all kinds of sizes, from large national companies to smaller local entities in all aspects of business. He assists ag clients from family farm startups to larger ag entities, both as it pertains to real estate acquisitions, sales, and assisting in corporate structuring and governance. And that's what we're here to talk about today, Ryan, is corporate structuring.
Yep.
Who'd have thought the family farm could use some corporate structuring?
Well, the Family Farm Corporation has been around for a long time. I think some of the reasons you still see some of those corporations is because they were formed a long time ago. I know my family farm up in northwest Iowa, my dad's side of the family, they're Holland Family Farms, Inc. And because when they formed the thing, that was the option, right? So, the LLC is I call it relatively new. I mean, I'm 41, but relatively new vehicle. So the question I get a lot of times is, well, why do I need this? And my response is, I don't know that you do, right? I think sometimes you get folks in who say, well, I got a 40 or, I farm with my dad. I don't know that I want to go through the whole setup of a farm company. And then I think you have some older folks who say, well, I don't really know if I like the sounds of having my farm, having Inc. after my farm or having LLC in the name of my farm. Makes it sound too corporate. I don't understand all of it. I don't want to deal with it. I haven't had any problems till today, so why do I need to change?
They may not still have a problem today.
Right.
So, Ryan, I got a question for you. So we have all different types of structures. Okay, so me as a farmer, we start talking about this with our family, and there's this or that, and we're doing it. When I think of Inc., I think of business incorporated. When I think of LLC, limited liability, I think of liability. I think of being sued. I think of somebody suing me and losing. So I think a lot of farmers might say, oh, I probably need to do that. There's a lot of dollars moving here. Maybe we should do it for the liability. So, Tanner, I think one side is liability, but then on the other side is tax structure. And I wonder how many people make the decision of how they form their entity based on tax structure. Is it a pass-through entity? Do we get better tax advantages? And I'm going to guess, just taking a guess, that most farmers are more on the tax side of structuring their entity than they are on the liability side. What's your thoughts on that, Ryan?
I think most folks are thinking about dollars, right? And whether that's protection of liability or whether that's tax dollars, this is a good spot for me to give my normal caveat, which is I'm not a tax attorney, I'm not a CPA. I like working in teams. Y'all had Kyle Wywood on a couple weeks ago. I work with Kyle on a handful of different clients, and I'm always sending people his way. What I tell folks is I can get you in the right structure. We need to work with Kyle or whoever you work with to determine whether it's going to maximize dollars in your pocket at the end of the day, right? There are some basics, though, right, in terms of limited liability, like you point out, Dave, whether it's pass-through or whether it's a corporation. I'm almost always putting people into LLCs for the dirt portion just because it is pass-through. You have, obviously, with a corporation, you have 2 layers of taxation. If it's an S-corp, it's a pass-through, but then you have some technical issues with regard to inside basis and what happens when an owner dies. You get a step up of basis in an S-corp. So generally speaking, at like the 30,000-foot dummy level, like I am when it comes to tax, the dirt we want in a limited liability company or some form of pass-through partnership.
So let's pause there. I know some guys that make each farm a separate LLC because they think the liability that this one is farm number 1 LLC. This one is farm number 2 LLC. I see people that do rentals. This is 1801 Main LLC. This is 1601 Johnson Street LLC. What's your thoughts on that? Do we put every farm into an LLC or just one big, we are Whitaker Properties?
Yeah, it depends, right? And you're going to hear me say that a lot today. There's no cookie cutter solution. It's sort of like a continuum of, on the one end, you have administrative complexity and security. On the other end, you have administrative ease and less security.
Okay.
So the limited liability company protects, having that thing formed protects you from the farm, right? But also protects the farm from you. And with the dirt, that's actually the bigger deal, right? So a guy comes to me and says, hey, I'm starting an auto business. I want to put in an LLC. I say, that's great because you work on some guy's brakes and they fail and he smashes into somebody and you're just a sole proprietor. You're getting sued, right? You, Mr. Mechanic, are getting sued. If you are a farm owner, especially if you're an absentee landlord, I own land, I don't operate, right? I'm not doing anything inside that company that's going to subject me to personal liability. If I just own a farm in my name, probably no issues, right? Mm-hmm. But it's snowing out today. I'm driving home, smash into somebody, and I get sued. If I own that farm in my name, that farm's at risk.
Could be at risk, right.
So then to your question of, well, do I have one or do I have multiple? Depends what you're working with, but what that does is it isolates farm 1 from farm 2, right? You're operating farm 1, something happens there inside that box. Whatever's inside that box is at risk, but if farm 2 is in a separate company, it's not at risk.
Let's talk risk for just a second. I'm going to keep going on this, Tanner. Penetration clause is the next word. I got sued once. And I thought, I'm in an LLC. This is perfect. They're going to take whatever assets the LLC has. Nope. They filed a penetration clause right to my name and my house that I live in. How's that work? I have no idea.
Right. So what I tell people is I can generally prevent you from being ultimately liable. I can't prevent you from getting sued. Right. So, take whatever name you want. If they know that Dave owns Whitaker Farm LLC, they're suing you personally anyway, right? The other aspect is we are setting you up so that when you walk out the door, you're in good shape, but it's like anything else. If you don't follow corporate formalities, then it's not going to do you a lick of good. So if, hey, I have an LLC, but, well, I pay my truck payment out of the LLC checking account, or I don't do my contracts in the name of the company, or what have you, right? If you disregard it, then it's only going to be worth how you treat it. So it's important that you get the box set up, but you also need to, what I tell people is treat it like you're the manager, not the owner, right? So if you wouldn't do some action as manager of someone else's company, don't do it as manager of yours, because you're going to risk that commingling, that piercing of the corporate veil, right? So treat it like you're the manager, not the owner.
Yeah, so that's something that I've witnessed on the financial side of things is those that run various different entities, or for example, rental houses, and they run them all through the same account, but are keeping track of each property independently. Well, that doesn't do anything on the liability side because it's all commingled. You can still do that on the tax accounting side, which is fine. That's all record keeping. And I like the comment that you made early on about how complex you want it to be, that cost versus the liability side. Because I had just seen a couple of social media posts for someone that said they set up every door in their rental portfolio. So obviously they're talking living 1 to 4 family type properties or multifamily, and every door is in a different company's name. We're talking mainly to farmers and agribusiness owners, to where it's probably not necessary for every 80 to have a different LLC.
Right.
But it might be beneficial for our listeners if an 80 has a hog barn on it to be in its own separate LLC, and then the rest of the dirt could be in a different one. So maybe we're looking at a classification that way based upon structures that are on the property.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to risk, right? Being a landlord, the risk is just completely different. Being a landlord of residential property is just completely different than being a landlord of a farm, or certainly being an operator on a farm, right? We talk about isolating risk. When I work with family farm groups, or I'll work with consultant groups, you can hire these consultants. They bring you in, tell you kind of everything you're doing wrong, right? And they'll bring your attorney in, or sometimes I just come in anyway. What I talk about is isolating risk. So isolating risk versus value. So I have a client that they have dirt, they have hog barns, they have trucks, they have, meaning over the road trucks, right? They do hauling, they have their equipment, and then they have chemical. Well, the chemical we don't want in the same company as the company that owns all the dirt. We don't. There's high risk there just in terms of actual physical danger, right? Or if you're the operator and you own your farm, we talk about having an operating entity that is separate from the entity that owns the dirt. The operation itself is where all the just physical harm and risk is. We had, a couple years ago, a family farm that had a couple of employees. Guy dies on the job, right? A handful of years ago, not too far from here, guy is out in the field collecting field stones and gets run over by a tractor, right? Just crazy stuff that 99% of people, it's not going to happen to you. But it's like an insurance policy. Do you need it? Probably not. Is it really helpful to have it there? Yes.
So Tanner, we kind of dove in hard into legality, and then a little bit of taxation and tax implications. It just made me think. You said somebody passed. I wonder if there's a way to structure your entity, and I believe there is, differently when you're thinking of passing it on. And that's what Ryan works on with estate planning, is maybe we should be, there's a lot of acres here. Maybe we should be not an LLC, but a corporation, and give you shares. So the decision making for our listeners could be 3 different points of their life, I would think, to how we structure this. Because if I'm going to pass it on and I have 20,000 acres, I might meet limits that for inheritance tax, for other things that now, wait a minute, maybe, and I'm not the advisor here, but maybe we should be in a corporation and we'll start gifting you shares when you're 40 until you're 80 when I die.
So that brings up a good point, but let's finish out and exhaust the conversation on the LLC side of things.
Yeah.
So we don't confuse or get in a disorganized fashion here for this episode. We use LLCs because they're probably the easiest to run.
Yep.
The easiest to account for.
Yep.
And they're there to protect us liability-wise, or at least provide another layer of liability protection.
Yep.
What else is a benefit of an LLC, or did we get that wrapped up?
I mean, you pretty much got it wrapped up. And the one point I want to make as well is that, the limited liability company, my goal in setting up the operating agreement on an LLC is to make it so that you don't really know that it's there, right? You're into the business of farming. You're not into the business of corporate governance of the entity that owns your farm, right? Directors meetings and officers meetings and all that sort of thing, right? For sort of a typical family farm company, I'm setting up an LLC. We're naming a manager, and sometimes 2, and it's usually, both husband and wife, and they're doing everything inside the company. You don't have to have, corporate meeting minutes or anything like that. So for most intents and purposes, they don't know the difference between operating as an LLC or operating as husband and wife. I had one of my first jobs out of law school. A partner came to me and said, I need 15 years worth of meeting minutes for this company. I said, well, what do I put in them? He said, I don't care. Just make 15 years worth of minutes, because it's a corporate formality, going back to piercing the corporate veil, right? So if you set it up, your operating agreement, your bylaws say we have to meet once a month, and the company gets sued and there's no meeting minutes, there's no evidence that you're actually operating as a company, that can be a problem, right? So the way I try to set them up is wipe all that stuff out. We don't have required meetings. You can have meetings if you want. It's run by a manager. It's manager managed. So for the most part, husband and wife are signing everything, operating as husband, manager of LLC. But other than that, not really noticing any other differences.
So when you are doing this is what I would consider the first step up of not doing anything.
Right.
And now I want to know, when would we be doing an LLC versus an LLP? Are they very close related, or is the title misleading?
They are very closely related insofar as they're both partnerships at their heart, right? A limited liability company is a partnership with limited liability protection. A limited liability partnership is, in Iowa anyway, is a general partnership that has elected limited liability status.
Okay.
So the three of us form a partnership. We want it to be limited liability. We file a statement with the Iowa Secretary of State saying we've elected limited liability. The big difference for farming is that Iowa has really strict corporate farming regulations, right? Corporations, LLCs, limited liability, limited partnerships, and limited partnerships can't own agricultural property in the state of Iowa unless they're a family farm company or an authorized company. And agricultural property or agricultural land is a really broad definition, right? It covers just about everything. So the one thing that, and we're talking about directly or indirectly, right? Ownership directly or indirectly, which would also include leasing, okay? So the big difference between an LLC and a limited liability partnership is that a limited liability partnership is a general partnership which elects limited liability status, which is not generally covered under that Iowa Code 9H, which is the corporate ownership restrictions. So for most, if it's, you and your family, you and your wife, and I always talk about it in terms of what counts as a family farm company, start at grandpa and work your way down. And if you have the same grandpa, you're in family as far as the statute's concerned, right?
So you can go cousins.
You can go cousins. Yep. So,
But I can't, Dave and I are not related.
Right.
We don't have the same grandpa.
right. So you could each be, so you and Dave could form an LLC and you could buy a farm. It would be an authorized limited liability company because you say it is. It's formed for the purposes of farming, has more than 60% of its profits from farming. But the catch is you can't own more than 1,500 acres, okay?
Oh, it comes with a cap.
And you get one. So you can be in a company with Dave that owns a farm. You can't be in a company with me then if that company also owns a farm.
I was going to
Really?
say, why wouldn't we just do an LLC? My next question was, okay, they're single member LLCs. So if I'm a husband and wife listener, technically I have half of marital assets anyway.
Yep.
So I just put the company in my name, so there's one signature. Don't even worry about my wife. She's going to get half any way you look at it.
Yep.
Or how important is it to put her name on there? Okay, that's one question. I'm going to pause there. Tanner, if you and I, not husband and wife, we want to buy, we could still buy as an LLC. I think the question then comes, rather than the LLP, is what happens when we die? Do we take it as tenants in common? Do we take it as joint tenants? Or does the LLC own it and then we have a dissolution agreement if I die that the shares go to someone?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First question, answer the first question first. As husband and wife, I would say, what's your wife think? Honestly, that for me, a single member LLC is disregarded for tax purposes, so you're not getting K-1s if there's no partnership return, just shows up on your 1040, right? If spouse doesn't care, and that's usually what it boils down to most times, it's just family dynamic. If spouse doesn't care, then having a single member is the easier route to go, right? And then the second question, LLP versus LLC in terms of the succession planning, doesn't matter. There's zero difference because the governing document of either that partnership or that
articles
LLC,
of organization.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that is going to govern what happens, and that sort of dovetails into your question about estate planning. And I talk to clients, and it kind of depends what age group they're in, right? The folks who are in the younger age group, I'll consider us still in that age group, right? They're not worried about.
Well, you and I are. Dave's not.
Not worried about.
What do you say, 41?
Yeah.
I'm still a month away from that, so I am not the oldest person.
I got to
in the
give him a
room
hard
today.
time. He's usually the oldest one in the room.
I usually am.
I always tell people I'm either the oldest young person in the room or the youngest old person, depending upon which category I want to put myself
There you
in.
go. We're
So-
really close.
Yeah.
So the younger folks really just care about, one, maximizing dollars in the pocket, which we all care about that, right? But one of the best groups of folks I like to work with are people who are our age, who are starting to take over their family farm, the entire operation, and they come to me and say, here's what I have, what should I do? And it's this just really fun problem-solving exercise of, okay, we get to deal with this at a universal level, as opposed to the guy who comes to me and says, hey, can you form an LLC for me? Yeah, I can do that. I mean, and that's fine, you know. But the fun part is getting to work with these guys as a group. But so the younger guys are more concerned with, okay, I want to get in an LLC. Here's how I do it. The older crew is really talking about estate planning and succession planning, right? And one of the things that I talk to people about is how a company can be an effective estate planning tool, right? Because the number one thing I hear from people who are above our age group is, I don't want the farm sold,
Right.
right? And, you know, I got the farm from my dad, who got it from his dad. I don't want it sold. I have Junior, who works with me on the farm, but I have Sis, who's in Omaha, and, you know, she is a banker or a lawyer and, you know, doesn't really care.
Two very admirable professions.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome professions, right?
I like them when they sell them.
And so the LLC or the corporation, whatever the formal business entity is, can be a useful estate planning mechanism insofar as, one, you can talk about gifting, right? And we're in this place now where for most folks, estate tax is not an issue. You know, we're at $12 million per person, $24 million for married couples. Sunsets in the end of 25 unless Congress does something. Keep my editorializing to myself on that. But so for most folks, estate tax isn't an issue. Income tax is, though, so making sure we get ourselves in a good place for step up and basis when we pass it on. But if you are in a space where, one, you either want to get your kids or other family members sort of skin in the game, so to speak, having a company where you're gifting units or you're selling units even to your kids. But the other part is, you know, we have this thing in Iowa, and they have it in a lot of states, but it's called partition, right? So the three of us own a farm, Dave, Tanner, and Ryan, not in a company, just the three of us, and I want to sell. And you guys say, well, I don't want to sell. I can force your hand, right? I can go to a court and say, I want out. And the court will either partition it in kind, meaning I get a third, you get a third, you get a third. But if that can't be done, it gets sold, right? And here, at least in central Iowa, we have some nice farms that are potentially easily partitioned. They're nice square chunks, no ditches, no waterways, no road. But that's not often the case. I mean, even when you have farms that are right next door to each other, you might have one CSR in the high 70s and one CSR in the low 90s. And so it's hard to partition that stuff in kind if you're trying to do it based on value. So a lot of times they end up getting sold, right? Or even just the threat of that happening can be a problem, right? Well, if I own family farm, put it in a limited liability company, and that's what I leave to my kids, Sis in Omaha, who's the lawyer, doesn't own real estate. There's no partition power there, right? So she can't force the sale of the farm because all she owns are units in the company, and the operating agreement that we have drafted really kind of locks her in, right?
Right.
The way that
or spells out really clearly how
what
she
have
gets
to
out.
happen. Yep. And so, I mean, again, it's not cookie cutter. There's any number of ways to do it. But what I try to do is really just lock people in, and you can't get out unless the other partners say you can get out. And we've already sort of set up the dominoes for how the purchase works, what the price is, and all that good sort of thing. So it can be a really useful estate planning mechanism. The other issue is, I was on a call today with a client who mom passed away. They all live in Idaho, but mom owns an 80 over by Nevada. Well, she's going through probate now in Idaho, and I think maybe Wyoming as well, and in Iowa. She owns property in 3 states, right? If you own the limited liability company, you don't own property. You don't own the real estate here, right?
Oh.
So she could have formed an LLC, perhaps even an Idaho LLC, depending upon some other issues, put the farm in that, and she doesn't own Iowa property. She owns Idaho property, right? Or, which is we're not talking about trusts here, but, put the thing in the trust. Right. You don't own property in Iowa.
And you avoid probate.
You avoid probate.
Just one of my questions was, how do we avoid opening probate or opening an estate where we have to open the estate, go through the whole process, give everybody an opportunity on that? If we just have a will, that doesn't mean that it automatically goes to our kids, does it?
Right. So let's take just the usual setup, right? Husband and wife, they both have wills that says everything goes to my spouse, and then when the spouse dies, everything goes to the kids, right?
Yeah.
If everything they own is jointly owned, meaning joint with full right of survivorship, and y'all are very familiar with that term, right? Then everything automatically passes to the surviving spouse, right? So you might be thinking back like, well, you told me just have the company in my name only, right? Well, what happens if I die first? Do I have to go through probate to get that passed over to my wife?
Yeah.
And so I'll give away the secret, I don't know if it's a secret, but the thing I tell clients is, Dave, your wife comes to me and says, Dave passed away. Everything we owned was jointly titled, except for he had a farm LLC where he was the sole owner, right? I'd say, well, who's your accountant? Well, go to him and tell him that Dave's gone, and tomorrow the books need to show you as the owner. Is that the technical, super duper legal route? No, but in terms of no one's, quite frankly, no one's losing out there.
Right.
It's not like real estate or like your car or a bank account where there's a third party gatekeeper, right? Because it's a family company, Now, if the 3 of us were in an authorized farm LLC and we have these buy-sell restrictions in there, and you die and your wife goes to the lawyer and says, hey, Dave had this in his name only, I'm probably going to say, I need an estate opened because we are probably going to be buying back your units, and I'm not paying your wife for those units unless she has the authority to transfer them, and she doesn't unless she's the executor.
I got you.
Right? So the next step, though, is to take those units of your family farm LLC and put them in a trust, right? And then the trust owns the units. You don't own the units, and so when you die, the trust just carries forward with them.
So I've heard, you see on the plat book, Tanner, all the time, revocable trust, non-revocable trust. What the heck's the difference?
So we almost never use irrevocable trusts anymore. The difference is exactly what it sounds like. One is revocable, one's not, right? Revocable trust is really the sole point of it is to avoid probate. So if everything that you own is owned through a trust, you don't own anything when you die, you skip go, right? Take your $200 and move on. The irrevocable part comes in where your revocable trust becomes irrevocable when you die because the only guy who could have revoked it's dead. Right? So we will set up irrevocable trusts. I'm not like a high level estate planning attorney. I'm not dealing with guys who are $50 million net worth or anything on a daily basis. But we'll still deal with irrevocable, like life insurance trusts, for example. The irrevocable life insurance trust owns the life insurance policy so that when you die, it gets the proceeds, uses that money to pay the estate tax, for example. The tax code these last decade plus has been such that guys like me just don't need to do that sort of planning, right? $24 million for married couples, $12 million for individuals. There just aren't that many guys out there walking around nudging up against that number. Land values notwithstanding, right?
Yep.
So no, I mean the estate planning part of the limited liability company is, I think, twofold. It makes the gifting part during your life easier. I saw an abstract I was working on a couple weeks ago where they were clearly trying to do some gifting during their life over time, and it was, 1996 gift 8/300ths to Jim, 1997 gift 8/300ths to Jim, of the ground, which just then becomes a nightmare to try to follow along.
Right.
If that thing was an LLC, you're just gifting the units, and the owner never changes, right? So the gifting part, I think the partition part is also a really big deal. It locks people in. It also then imposes some structure on that next generation, especially where you have on-farm kid, off-farm kid, which anymore you almost always do. Even if the other siblings, and this is what I run into all the time, even if the other siblings don't want to sell the farm, they love that they are a part owner of the family farm company. They sometimes want to tell you how to run the family farm, right? And even if they have no idea what they're talking about, they're kind of imposing themselves. Well, it's set up in a company. There are rules of the road that are in the operating agreement. And generally the rules of the road are going to say, unless you're the manager, it doesn't matter what you say.
Doesn't matter what you say.
Right? So,
Tanner, I've already learned something from this one. I know that my father-in-law needs to make an LLC. That's exactly what I've gathered from this.
But did you hear that though? A father-in-law.
Yes,
Yeah.
my father-in-law needs.
well, that might even be more important, right? Because if you're son-in-law, what does son or daughter, other than your wife, have to say about the whole deal, right? Or I'll have families where mom and dad come in and say, we know, so Junior's been working with us for 20 years. We know that this is going to be a problem. How do we avoid the problem? Not to keep the farm even, but to make sure that he doesn't have issues, right? We
Doesn't
see
lose
him
his
as
income.
a business
Yep.
partner. Right, exactly. He is operating. He's not an absentee landlord. This is his livelihood. How do we make sure that that doesn't go away?
And Tanner, you and I have had conversations, even in my realm, that if I know the other two brothers and sisters are going to sell, how do we prepare for that and have enough money to be able to buy them out, like strategy to get ahead of that? But that's a whole different subject. On your partition, so people call me and ask me to, hey, I'm a sister. I want my percent out of here. How do I get this? And they can file for partition action. Iowa changed the law a few years ago. Don't they have to have at least 25% ownership? Like if you're only a 5% owner, yeah, you can't force my hand.
So the one thing that did change was if it is inherited property. So if it's, they call it heirs property. So if my brother and I inherit farm from dad, I can't force the sale of that without essentially offering it for purchase to my brother first. The problem is, I mean, you were talking before we started, $16,000 an acre ground. It's difficult even to get financing, and you can probably speak to this too, obviously, Tanner. If I am a 50% owner and I come to you and say, I need to buy out my brother, and the ground, let's say, is perfect scenario, is unencumbered, right? And we have a great tenant who's paying, let's pick a high number, $450 an acre. So like just your best borrower that you can think of.
Yep.
I'm an attorney who does fine. Like that guy still has a mortgage probably, right? He has other debts. It's not just what does that dirt look like as security to the bank. It's what else is going on in that guy's life, right? And it's his, if it's of any substantial size or even nominal size these days, if it's a couple hundred acres, $10,000 an acre, you're going to spend $1 million.
Yep.
Most people aren't signing on. They're just not ready to, even if you said, hey, we can do it.
Yeah. There's a lot of people that aren't comfortable with borrowing $1 million.
Just to buy out brother and sister.
Just about brother and sister.
Yep.
And that's with, say even we make it even a more perfect world where we have we have a lease that's locked in, and it is 5-year lease with landlord 5-year option, and it's rents based on cash rent survey, and like that guy's just locked in. Even then, I mean, if for most of us who are just sort of working schlubs, and if you're not an entrepreneur who's used to taking risks, that can be a
big jump.
scary deal.
Tanner, one other thing that I just totally came to mind. So we were talking about LLC, kind of locks in the fact that we can't partition it off. So when I was elk hunting in Montana just recently, got to go with a friend out there who is joining a family ranch. And on their family ranch, I was asking him, well, what if they sell and what's that look like? And he said that they had it set up at their entity that they could sell, but it had to be given away as a gift, that none of the kids of the ranch can benefit if they sell it. It all goes to charity somewhere, so that incentivizes all the kids not to sell it. So that's something I never thought of.
They really have to be tired of working there.
They had to be tired.
They all have to be tired.
Yep, and they can give it away, but they cannot sell it for profit.
Well, and some of those places, obviously, I don't know anything about Montana and what their real estate laws are. I wish I did. Then I could move there and be a Montana real estate attorney. But on some of those, you're talking about conservation easement setups, right? And those are a little bit easier to do, even running cattle, just because of the amount of space you're dealing with, as opposed to having a conservation easement on, 80 acres of row crop, for example, right? The other bit is if you and I inherit the family farm through a corporation and we're the sole shareholders, well, guess what? We can just change the bylaws, right? So I'm guessing it would be something that is either in a trust, right? That can't. So that's where maybe like an irrevocable trust would come in. So I'm a beneficiary of the trust. And even if I'm the only one, I can't change it because it's irrevocable.
Yep.
And it's potentially even managed by a third-party fiduciary, corporate fiduciary, or it's in so some sort of land trust or some sort of conservation easement would be my guess on those. The one catch on something like that is you don't know what you don't know, and maybe 20 years from now it would be really advantageous for your family, even maybe for the farm, to be able to sell the farm or to mortgage it or lease it. And if you have something that is just totally locking out a sale, you could run into problems.
Right. Okay, so we've talked a lot about LLCs, and then we did a little bit about the difference between that and an LLP, and we got a little bit into trusts, whether revocable or irrevocable. Let's kind of get back on the tracks here and talk about more entity structures, because in the beginning, you mentioned old-timers had their farms incorporated. So what's the next step? What types of corporations exist?
Well, so you have C Corp and you have S Corp, right? S Corp is pass-through. C Corp is 2 layers of taxation.
Let's expand on pass-through just a little bit in case our listeners don't know. For a listener that doesn't know what pass-through, what is pass-through?
So the simplest way to explain it is all the deductions are taken at the personal level, at the ownership level, at the individual level. So if the two of us own a company and it makes $100,000, the company does not file a return paying tax on that income and then give us the $50,000 each. It shows the income. We each report that through a K-1 on our tax return, and all the deductions that we might take depending upon our individual, family tax situation happen at the individual.
So how does the corporation know who gets what K-1? Is there percentages set up that this brother's 50%, this brother's 50%?
Yep.
There is.
So,
okay. So that's an S Corp.
Well, so the general rule of thumb, at least in partnership taxation, right, and an S Corp is taxed as a partnership. One side note, and this is where guys like Kyle are really, really helpful, is that an LLC can be taxed as a partnership. It can be taxed as an S Corp. It can be taxed as a C Corp, right? So you have that flexibility as an LLC, which is another nice thing about it, is you can elect different types of taxation and stay an LLC.
I got you.
And it can change.
It can change.
Just because you started off being taxed as one,
right?
You can make an election. Now, it's been advised that you don't switch back and forth every year.
Right. Well, and you have all sorts of issues, if you do try to switch back and forth, right, especially if you have appreciating assets, like hopefully you do if you own land, right?
Doing well.
Yep. So back to your question, basic level is, C Corp gets taxed 2 levels. The corporation, the old corporations are people too type of thing. That corporation's paying tax, and then you're paying tax on the profits that you make. The LLC, the S Corp, it's passed through, and the entity doesn't pay tax. It's just the owners at their individual tax.
So why would we? I'm probably going to take a question out of your mouth. So why would you even want to be a C Corp? What's the benefit of being a C Corp?
Generally, I wouldn't.
Okay. So it exists, but it's not probably something our listeners are going to use.
The only thing that I was thinking that I was going to ask is, if you're a C Corp, are you, if me, Tanner, we're all a C Corp, are we now W-2 employees for the C Corp, and can we get our 40 quarters for Social Security if we do it that way, rather than just as sole proprietors?
There are a couple things, and again, this is where y'all should put a little thing above my head.
I'm not a tax accountant.
Not a CPA, right? Because when I do deals with Kyle, even, I learn something new from him on the minutia. Every time,
right,
got to remember to write that thing down. Sorry, but one of the 4 C Corps, for example, or even S Corps, there's a cap on it, but you can have retained earnings, right? As an LLC or partnership, our company could have show profit of $500,000, and we're 50-50 owners, and I get taxed on that $250,000, even if the company never distributes it to me, right? So with a C Corp, if the dividend doesn't get paid out, I'm not getting taxed on it. So I don't want to say never, but for most of the folks I'm dealing with that are either small, or they are small going to medium, and some that are maybe even medium going into bigger. And when I would call bigger anything over 1,500 acres, 2,000 acres, getting into that range. We're still talking LLC. It still makes most sense to be flexible on it. Now, your question though, you can still be. There becomes questions of passive versus active, right? On the type of income, there become questions of retirement. Okay, what kind of retirement accounts can I have set up through the company? There comes questions of health insurance and benefits and those sorts of things. So there are cases where a corporation, and it doesn't always need to be C Corp, it can be S Corp in a lot of those cases, but where you can have employer-sponsored plans, maybe through a C Corp or an S Corp, that you might not be able to have as an LLC.
And for our listeners that aren't in the state of Iowa or Illinois or Midwest, when we're saying 1,500 acres, really, let's put a dollar amount to it. $15 million is probably where that level is. Do you have a level that, if you're Montana and it's $1,000 an acre, or Kansas and it's $2,000 an acre, it might be 3 times as many acres or 5 times as many acres, but probably that 15 million threshold or higher. Is there a threshold that our farm did so well that we made $25 million this year, we cannot take taxes on that? We better make a C Corp so that we can hold some of this retained earnings, still pay everybody out, but hold retained earnings in our big organization. Is there a limit when we get there that it's this does not make sense to do it? Okay, we make $25 million a year, we probably better be a C Corp.
Yeah, on an S Corp, there is a cap on retained earnings. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but there is a cap on it, right?
Okay.
The one thing I would say too, and this goes back a little bit to the intro, I have a guy who I just had in last week, and they're working on buying a farm, and they don't have they have nothing set up, right? It's father son. It's the way it's always been. They got nothing, and they're running probably 4,500 acres. That is very rare, in my experience. By the time you have hit even 400 or 500 acres, you've decided, hey, I need to talk to somebody, right?
Yeah.
So if you're at a $25 million number, you're talking to me and 10 other guys. If you haven't, hit pause on this. Call your lawyer. If you don't have a lawyer, call your brother.
Go to the Google machine and find the closest lawyer to you.
Or call me and we can hook you up. We have offices in Minneapolis, Mankato, Fargo, Bismarck, Madison. I work with folks from Denver to Florida. So yeah, if you are in that spot and you're like, I've never needed it. If you're in the David Whitaker strata, hit pause, call a lawyer because you're behind. You're behind. So, but for the most part, when we're talking about like entity choice, we're talking about folks who are sort of starting out, trying to figure out, or in the case of a couple clients like Kyle and I are working with, it's restructuring, reorganizing. Hey, the family farm has always been in this C Corp. How in the world can we undo that, right? So that if it becomes beneficial at some point to sell some or a portion of the dirt, the owners aren't getting nailed twice, right?
So you brought up selling, and we just a couple weeks ago had David and Scott on for land value updates. And they said a lot of the buyers and some of the sellers are doing this with 1031 exchange funds.
Yep.
How are these corporate structures going to either make that process smooth or potentially add some complications to a 1031 exchange?
Yeah, they're adding complications.
Yeah, they are.
They're just flat out going to add complications. The last couple years, I would say, just as a preface to this, I've heard a lot of tax advice where the advice was pay the tax, right?
Sure.
If rates are X today, and we think in 10 years they're going to be X times 2, for example, which God help us, but X times 1.2, the 1031 is deferring.
Right. If you think taxes are going up, you defer to a larger tax bill.
Right. You're deferring to a larger tax bill. Pay the tax, lock in your basis, figure it out later. But they do complicate because the entity that buys needs to be the entity that sells, or the entity that sells needs to be the entity that buys, right? So if you have Farm 1 LLC, Farm 2 LLC, Farm 3 LLC, Farm 4 LLC, and I have some clients like that, right? And they're like, hey, we want to sell this farm and we want to buy this other farm, but we don't have the cash from the exchange necessarily to buy the farm that we want to buy. We're going to have to kick in cash somewhere from some other of our companies, right? Or maybe you're in a setting where it's a family farm company, for example, so you don't have mixed investors or anything, but you have people who are part of one of them, not part of the other, and they don't want to do that. They want to cash out, right? So it can get complicated. And not even necessarily complicated. It can just get so you lose some maneuverability.
Now, I've worked with some clients that had an LLC, 2 sisters, 1 brother, and they decided they were going to sell, and 2 of them decided they want to reinvest, but the one didn't. They wanted to cash out. And so the attorney, I think, had them do a dissolution agreement for the LLC, but then we had a time frame to make sure that we weren't just dissolving it to then sell immediately. They waited 3 years, I think, until they finally decided. I mean, I've been working with them for years. They decided to strategically plan this. Then 3 years later, we sold the farm. But then is there a red flag limit for dissolution agreements for 1031s?
Yes and no, right? The problem is there's no safe harbor. So much of the tax code, they at least provide you a safe harbor, right? If you hold it for at least 12 months, right? I tell people 2 years. Don't plan on less than 2 years. The other issue, though, is, and I've done deals just like that, where you have 3 siblings, 1 wants out or 2 want out, or one says, I want to reinvest in a Dollar General store in Mason City, right? So you can do all that, and you can strategically plan it. The problem is if you strategically plan that on paper, right, and you say, here's what we're doing, the 1031 is for reinvestment. It's investment purposes. And so if on day one you say, oh, I'm not really doing this for investment purposes, I'm doing this to wait it out and then get my money and go buy my Dollar General store, that could be a problem for your 1031. And it could be a problem for your 1031 4 years down the road, which makes it even worse, right? You've spent that money that you're going to have to pay in tax. So we've done them before. I've done them before personally. I always caution against it if it's anybody other than like your brother, quite frankly, because it's got to be a handshake. It's got to be an understanding. Farm company sells the farm, and you buy 2 farms to replace it. One for brother 1, one for brother 2. We can't that can't be reduced to writing anywhere. If that's the plan, then you haven't purchased it for investment purposes potentially, right?
Right.
So one, y'all have to hope that nobody dies in those 2 years. And two, right,
Yes.
you have to just really trust the other person that when the end of those 2 years occurs, then we can do our dissolution. The company distributes farm 1 to brother 1, farm 2 to brother 2, and you go your separate ways.
So we've talked about that. That's doing it beforehand. If you want to do that, I've also had it where brothers together just said, "Well, let's just buy the farm. So whoever we sell the farm, we're selling this farm because somebody made us a good offer, and it's going to be development ground or something. Wow, their offer was fantastic. We've kept it. We're in an LLC. Let's just go find more farms to buy in an LLC, and then they own the new farms in LLCs, and they just keep them and rent them out for the next 5 years or so. And then they say, okay, now we're 5 years down the road. The LLCs still own these other farms that we just found as replacement. Now let's figure out how we split them up. And then they split them up, and then they sell them at that point and make their own.
Yep.
But they still use the tax advantage of a 1031. But you have,
Right.
however you sell is how you have to buy the new one.
Well, but the key thing to what you just said is the tax advantage of the 1031 is they didn't avoid tax. They just delayed
Just
the
right.
taxation event.
Yeah, and the case with like those 2 brother clients too, those are great clients to have because they only sold because they got a good offer.
Yep.
They didn't sell because they wanted to do something different. I had not a couple, brother and sister sold an apartment building. One wanted to buy a condo, one wanted to buy a retail, like strip mall, right? Those are very different things, and they were selling the apartment building not because they got a fantastic offer, but because they wanted to split, but they didn't want to pay tax on the split, essentially, right? Or at least not at that point. So those are the ones that are difficult, where you have to say, okay, here's the plan, but we're not writing this down anywhere, not even in emails, right? Because if the number is big enough, the risk of undoing that 1031 down the road, I use plane crash analogy all the time. Probably won't happen, but if the plane does crash, everybody dies, right? So it's one of those deals. Probably not going to actually be a problem, but as attorneys, and I assume, even as a lender, you talk about worst case scenarios. That's kind of the conversation. What's worst case scenario?
Right.
So now I have a question I never thought of before. In all of my dealings, I get father wants to 1031 ground to son, and there are rules that you can't 1031 family
Related
related
rules.
parties.
Yep.
What if son starts an LLC? Can LLC buy the farm from non-related party? Or
Yeah, there's still
how's that work?
imputed. There are still imputed relationships when it comes to owners of the company and family members of owners.
There are.
of the
Okay, so you
company.
can't. It's not a loophole to get around it.
Right.
So we've talked C corps, we've talked S corps, we've talked LLCs, LLPs. We briefly touched on joint tenants, and
So it's not really necessarily an entity structure, but as a way to own land together.
It is. It's how you buy it, or how you buy it. How are you going to
Yep.
take title of something?
Right.
Yep. Yeah, we've covered quite a bit today and covered quite a bit of your time. Do we miss anything that really sticks out, or should we get ready to wrap it up?
So I tell folks that the LLC is, like I said, it's a box that we create. What you make of it is on you. It's also not a silver bullet, right? You should have insurance, and your agreements, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, are actually the front lines of defense, So what do your leases look like? I mean, I would like to see what the percentage is in this state, for example, of leased ground that actually has a written lease agreement.
Right.
If you
Or
said
still honoring the terms of the original lease agreement.
right, if you said, you have to bet one way or the other, is it over or under 50%? I would probably bet under.
Pick the under.
At least in terms of parties. Number of acres, I might bet over just because, over the last 15, 20 years, you had so many sort of corporate buyers come in. But leases are really, really important. And how that flows through with making sure it's the entity that's on the lease, making sure that your lease or the memorandum of lease is recorded, as is required, right? By law, by statute, have that stuff recorded, and it protects you.
Yep.
So insurance and leases, I think, are probably under discussed when you talk about company formation. Insurance and leases are going to be your first line of defense. The LLC is there sort of like your insurance policy on the back end.
Yeah. So last question I have is around cost. We've never set one of these up before. If a listener's never gone through that part of the equation, what are we looking at least in the state of Iowa with your experience?
Yep.
What's it look like to set something up and maintain it?
So the setup, it depends, right? But if you and your wife come in and say, hey, we want to set up Family Farm Limited Liability Company, I say, Tanner, I bet that I can get you an operating agreement that you're going to just say, yep, looks good. And we're not going to go back and forth 100 times on revisions, right? Something like that with the filing fee, you're talking like $650, $700,
Okay.
Cheaper than your crop insurance for any given year. If you come to me and say, hey, Dave and I and 2 other guys are forming an authorized LLC, and we want to talk about how we do that with investor members and pref return and management structures and all that sort of thing, it really becomes, I don't say sky's the limit, but becomes sky's the limit.
Sure.
Some of the folks Kyle and I have worked with, for example, we're 3-4 years into the organization or reorganization. So what are you starting out with? If you're starting out with nothing, that actually makes it kind of easier.
Right. Clean slate.
On the maintenance side, it's really easy. You get a little note card or anymore an email from the Secretary of State every 2 years. It says, file your biannual report. You enter the code into the computer, click go, and I think it's $45 now.
Right.
And that's it, right? The maintenance part, especially for husband-wife type setup, family farm, LLC, again, the point is not to make you have weekly or monthly or even annual meetings for the company. So the maintenance side is really easy in terms of cost and time. There should not be a whole lot to it.
Good. Well, I'm going to work on a summary, but give you a little bit of heads up on the last question that we are going to ask you for the day. We appreciate your time. Let's first start with contact information and where you are employed. So that way, if someone does have a question, how can they find Ryan?
Sure. So I work for Frederickson and Byron Law Firm. It's a regional Midwest law firm based out of Minneapolis. Like I said, offices, I always have to remember Mankato, Fargo, Bismarck, Madison, Des Moines, and as of this past summer, Ames. So I am in Ames. You can find us online, fredlaw.com. We'll have my phone number and email available. I'm always happy to take calls, even if you're just like, I don't know if I want to do any of this, but hey, I have a couple questions.
Right.
So feel free to give me a call. Like I said, working with guys who are either trying to figure out what they want to do or restructuring and getting to work sort of from a universal perspective is one of my favorite things. And so even if it's just, hey, I have a question, give me a call. You're not going to magically get a bill in the mail if you have 10 minutes worth of questions you want to.
Yeah, when you pull up the Fred Law website, it asks you to share your location. That's so they can send you a bill right afterwards.
Right. You have to put your credit card information in ahead of time.
No, that's good. I appreciate you coming in and sitting down and sharing your wisdom with us. So the question that we've been asking all of our guests here in the new year is, how do you define success? So think about that one as I try to summarize what we captured today. We wanted to kind of help you as a listener assess high level if your farm should be in some type of an entity, whether your land is in an entity, your livestock operation is in an entity, or your family farming operation. So we wanted to give you some insights into limited liability corporations, LLCs, David, LLPs, which we learned are limited liability partnerships that can elect that limited liability. We then tiered up a little bit later in the episode and got to a S Corp and C Corp conversation to kind of outline the way those work together. Right in the middle, Dave, we summarized the potential value that trusts can bring into the operation, whether it's revocable, which is the most common, or irrevocable, which isn't as common anymore, but are very clearly defined there as to what kind of control you have within those structures. We talked a lot around how we can use these entities in our estate planning process, whether we're looking to transfer assets ahead of time through gifts, or we're looking to kind of control the way assets can get shifted to the next generation once we do pass. We put quite a bit of time into the partition action conversation that protects you from that happening if you are within an entity structure that sometimes gets Dave business because one of the siblings is looking to force a sale there. And then lastly, as we kind of got things wrapped up, that there are various different characteristics amongst each one of these, and it's going to be different for every one of you that are listening to the show. So the key is to go find a trusted advisor, get an attorney and a CPA in the room at the same time if you can, because that's going to make the conversation the most efficient. And that will help you plan, whether you got 1031 exchanges on the mind, you're talking about succession planning, or you're trying to restructure a dysfunctional structure already. And lastly, it can be as expensive as you want it to be. It can also be as simple as a less than $1,000 potentially. A couple of simple meetings, get yourself an LLC put together between husband and wife. So that's the summary I've got here. Dave, what would you challenge our listeners to do after listening to today's show?
Man, I wasn't even paying attention. I was thinking. Well, I think we negated that LLP might not be the best option. That LLC is probably the best option unless you're really, really big operation, and then think to the bigger ones. So, I guess the challenge is simple. It's just make sure you're having the conversation to think about what your structure is or what it should be.
Right. I like that. You got to figure it out. If you're not in something, maybe you should. Doesn't mean you should be.
Right.
But at least make a call.
Yep.
I like that. Good challenge. So what do you define as success, Ryan?
Man, that's the toughest question you've hit me with today. So there is this book called Gilead. It is about a make-believe town in Iowa called Gilead, Iowa, and a pastor there. And the arc of the story is about his life and his family and that sort of thing. And there was a line in there that always stuck with me, that it was something along the lines of, men of his generation thought being useful was the most important thing they could be. So I've gravitated toward that. Be useful in whatever your setting is. For me, being successful is being a useful member of the team. I talked about enjoying working with people like Kyle, like y'all, or with a family trying to figure out what their problem is, getting their problem solved. Being a useful member of the team, to me, is, that's what I would equate with success. If they're like, hey, we got from point A to point B, and you had a part in it, and hopefully a really big part in it, to me, that's successful. If we got from point A to point B, and you really kind of slowed us down, then, even though you got there, that's not a successful deal, So being a useful part of that team.
I love this, Dave. We're early in the year asking this question, and we're already getting some really fun answers as we put this together. So, Ryan, thanks again for hanging out with us.
Thanks for having me.
And sharing us the education that we've got on entity structures. We really appreciate that. Listeners, we appreciate you hanging out with us. Remember, farmforprofitllc@gmail.com, or you can send us a text to 515-207-9640 if you have something else you want us to talk about, or you yourself want to get on a show. But until next time, have a good one.